All right. So good morning and welcome to the first Skills for California Power Hour. Today we will highlight training and hiring strategies that lead to good jobs for immigrant communities and English language learners. I'm Zima Creason, the Executive Director of the California Edge Coalition. Skills for California is a partnership led by the California Edge Coalition and the National Skills Coalition. Skills for California is a statewide network of organizations advancing workforce development policies that remove systematic barriers and promote an inclusive economy for all Californians. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be shared after the event. The Q&A feature is open, so feel free to post questions and we'll respond live if time allows. If not, we'll follow up with an email with answers to the questions post-event. So without further ado, we know an hour goes fast. I'd like to introduce you to Ana Alvarado, Edge's Policy Director and the moderator for today's session. Ana, take it away.
Thank you, Zima. Again, my name is Ana Alvarado, Policy Director for Edge, and I'm very excited for today's discussion. As my friends here know already, I am a very proud daughter of Mexican immigrants, first generation, proud ESL kid. So I'm very excited for today's topic. It's very near and dear to my heart. So looking forward to the discussion today. And let's kick it off with introductions. So maybe we can go around with our panelists and please introduce yourself and your organization. And maybe we can start off with Sasha.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Sasha Feldstein. I'm the Economic Policy Director for California Immigrant Policy Center.
Thanks, Sasha. How about Mark?
Hi, everyone. Mark Philpart. I am a managing director at PolicyLink, and I also support the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based in Oakland, California.
Thanks, Mark. And last but not least, Joseph.
Hi, good morning, all. My name is Joseph Villela, Director of Policy and Advocacy with CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. We are a statewide membership organization with national impact, and we mostly serve and advocate with immigrants and refugees here in California.
Thank you, Joseph. So let's dive right into some of the questions that we have for you today. And the first question is, what are the top barriers documented, undocumented, and refugee communities and English language learners face when they are working to secure good jobs?
Thank you. So I'll take a crack of that first question. So I think the first one is that, first we have to understand that immigration status is very different and it's not fluid. So I think starting from that perspective, you have different access to different services. So I'm just going to give you an example to see how at times the system, a one-fit-all system may not be appropriate for immigrant communities, especially depending on different statuses. So for instance, if you're a refugee, if you're granted that status, you not only have access to federal safety net programs, but you also have access to case management that at times allows you to help you find housing and also job training programs. And this is because there's federal funding attached to that. And then there's also an infrastructure, for you as a refugee who have been granted that status to essentially have the resources that you need to essentially be integrated to society. Compare that to asylum seekers who are also granted the status. They have the same essentially protections and access to the same program, but they don't have a case management at times. And that means that they have to essentially go through the system on their own. And at times that's difficult for them to find housing, programs that they are eligible to, and including job training. So I think that's just one example of some of immigrants who have a legal status, but they don't have access, in this case, to case management under federal law. There's some laws that were changed at the state level that would allow asylum asylum seekers who have been approved to potentially also have case management to help them through that process. And obviously we have individuals who are undocumented, who do not qualify for the job training per se, because many of those dollars are restricted based on the 1996 law that passed that restricted many of those funding, which I think, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have under federal law, is that 1996 essentially not only criminalized immigrants, it also kicked them out of federal funded programs. And this included lawful residents. And there's this, rule that you only qualify to some safety net programs once you have your green card for more than 5 years. And then there's also some penalties regarding to that. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that immigrant communities face when it comes to job training. The last thing that I will say is that we have in LA, in the city of Los Angeles, there's a good number of immigrants who come to the States with their higher education already from the native countries, either a BA, a master's, or even PhDs. And we don't have a system in place to actually recognize their education or a process that is uniform for them to try to get back into that field. And so I think that's one of the other biggest challenges that we have as it relates to ways in which immigrants may not have access to job trainings or secure jobs. And the last thing that I will say is obviously the absence of Congress and to enact a comprehensive immigration reform. That's one of the biggest challenges that we have. We have seen data that once, especially those who are protected under DACA, once they were able to get protection under DACA, not only did they change jobs, their wages went up, they got houses, they got cars, because they were no longer tied to a job that may was either minimum wage or did not allow them to think about their their well-being and the financial well-being in the future.
Thank you, Joseph, for that perspective. Any others that would like to comment? All righty, we'll move on to the next.
Sorry.
Oh, go for it, Sasha.
I just want to add a couple of things. I think that was a really, really good overview of some of the barriers that are unique to immigrant communities and helped break down access in terms of different immigration statuses. So thank you so much. I do want to lift up a couple other things that I actually think are not just unique to immigrant communities, but applicable to all communities of color, where we find that a lot of the barriers that immigrant communities face are the same as what communities of color who are born here face, because of the root of a lot of those barriers lies in structural and systemic racism that leads to occupational segregation, where you have immigrants and communities of color concentrated in the most exploited, underpaid, and precarious industries. Rework the Bay has done a lot of work on this, NELP and others. But I do want to lift that up, that a lot of these barriers that we might talk about as unique to immigrant communities are actually cut across communities of color. Some other things that come up that I think cut across are that the skills of low-wage workers and immigrants are not valued as such. So we don't talk about the labor that domestic workers, day laborers, farm workers do as highly, highly skilled labor, caregivers as well. And so that influences the way we think about job training and moving people up into careers when we put up this very false narrative of low skilled jobs. And so I think we need to kind of reframe the conversation, because I think it's that narrative that is creating some very real structural barriers for our communities. And then I also think that there are other structural barriers within our workforce development system that create unnecessary hurdles for communities. Joseph talked about work authorization documents. That's true for immigrants as well as people who are born here, who have to, submit highly sensitive, private, personal documents just to, be able to participate in a job training program. And with CIPC, we actually did a survey with our partners at EDEPSCA, CUA, and POC on day laborers who cited inflexible scheduling, location of services, transportation barriers, childcare needs, all of these other barriers to accessing services, as well as the very real lack of ineligibility due to immigration status.
And if I could just build on some of those comments, the brain waste that we experience in the immigrant community is really significant. Millions of immigrants, including refugees, have an advanced degree. Nearly half of immigrants arriving to the US already have at least a bachelor's degree, as reported by the Migration Policy Institute. And what we are finding is that, as Sasha pointed out, the high degree of occupational segregation really limits the pathways that many of these individuals can kind of utilize in order to maximize their skills and their talent, their educational training. And so, how do we kind of break through becomes the question, but that's really one of the big fundamental barriers. As Sasha pointed out, their skills aren't recognized. Their educational achievement is ignored, and then they're forced into low wage, poor quality jobs. So breaking down those barriers is really critical as we move forward.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks you everyone for that perspective. Definitely highlighting the need for more social safety net services and access, and making sure that those barriers are removed for these communities. Definitely critical moving forward. Next question on our list is, what are some emerging opportunities from recent policy victories?
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, Sasha, I'm going to let you, I wanted to let you break the news, but since you put me on the spot, I'll just say we're elated that Governor Newsom has just signed AB 628, which is the Breaking Barriers to Employment Initiative. This is a bill that is really building on AB 1111, which is the initial version, which was passed in 2017. And Sasha, the California Immigrant Policy Center, the California Workforce Association, CROP Organization, and others in partnership with PolicyLink and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color were responsible for co-sponsoring this, and we really appreciated the help from the California Edge Coalition and Skills for California in furthering this. We couldn't have done it without you, but this bill has some really important changes, some really fundamental changes that allow for us to, I think, take workforce training and development to another level in California, in particular as it relates to racial equity. We were able to, in this iteration of the bill, be more intentional and specific about racial equity, racial justice within the context of labor and employment. So that is firmly cemented in the grant program as the intent of the grant, to be able to address those gaps and those challenges in labor force participation. We also were able to create a pathway for community organizations to apply directly to be able to engage in this program in a way that is not buoyed to or limited by the local workforce associations. And it's not that those agencies don't play a role. They do play an important role. It's just that community organizations are really the ones who are deeply connected to some of the more marginalized groups, and yet have to do a dance in terms of partnership with local workforce agencies that can become cumbersome, both for the CBO and for the workforce agency. And so really trying to create a more direct line from the CBO to the State Workforce Development Board was a huge change that we believe will be beneficial. There were some other changes that we made too in terms of qualifications, really kind of bottom lining that, in order for grantees to be eligible, they have to have a certain percentage of their staff represent the target population, a certain percentage of their board represent the target population. When I say target population, they have to be people of color, people who are listed as some of the marginalized groups that this program is seeking to serve. And so those are some of the big changes. Sasha, please fill in for anything I may have missed, but we're really excited about this. And we've also done some tweaking around some of the allowable uses of the resources so that they can be more flexible to meet the needs of some of the organizations and the populations that are being served.
Yeah, I think I mean, that was a great overview. Thank you, Mark. I think the only thing I would add about AB 628 is that our hope is that some of the lessons learned from AB 628 and the way it gets implemented and some of the legislative intent behind it can actually be used to help frame and shape conversations around other workforce development investments. This year's budget included $30 million for the Breaking Barriers to Employment Initiative, which is awesome. It also included millions more for things like high road training partnerships and other workforce development initiatives. And I'm hoping that AB 628 really pushes us to have a deeper, more explicit and accountable conversation around racial equity and who's actually benefiting from those dollars.
Thank you, Sasha and Mark. Joseph, any other insights, any other victories that we saw this year, either from the budget or policy that you'd like to highlight?
No, I think, for us, and maybe this is pivoting to other, questions that we may have. I think for us, it's important to also know that before the training and having a strategies about good jobs, that then there's actual the same level of protection for all workers. So I think I do want to highlight some victories this year as it relates to domestic workers, in which obviously CITC was one of the co-sponsors of that bill. And so I think for us, it's important to know that, yes, there's many essential workers, such as domestic workers and farm workers, that kept us through the pandemic. And yet many of them, like the industry of domestic workers, did not have or do not have the same protections as any other worker. So I think for us, we need to start with the basic premise that all workers should have all the same rights. And I think that's it. It's a great victory that we had, not only for domestic workers, but then also with farmer workers, in which we are returning to actually salary, at least being able to folks to get paid the minimum wage instead of a piece approach, in which a report highlighted that with that system, government workers were earning at least an average $5 per hour instead of the minimum wage. And so I think before anything, and as we're trying to celebrate what happened recently, is that some of the lack of protections that we saw and we have fought for many years are actually came about this year. And so now the next step is continue that work, but then also think about how we can pivot to ensure that some of those populations have access to better jobs or other opportunities.
Thank you so much for lifting that up, Joseph. SB 321 and SB 62, Domestic Workers Health and Safety Bill, and the Garment Workers Bill. There were others as well, SB 606 and AB 701, dealing with warehouse workers. I think it's really important we don't talk about workers' rights and workforce development in the same breath, and I think we need to. And so I think, lifting those bills and opportunities up for the workforce development community to get more involved in and have more of a stake in, because we can't help people, access good jobs if we're not making those jobs, better in the process.
Thank you, Sasha and Joseph and Mark for that perspective. Definitely a lot of wins this year in terms of the populations that we're talking about, but we still have a lot of work to do ahead. So definitely appreciate that perspective. So next question, what are the policy opportunities that would close employment gaps and challenges facing immigrant communities? Feel free to jump right in.
I have a lot to say on this, but I know I've been talking a lot, so if other of us want to go first.
Go ahead, Sasha.
Okay. So I think, first, as Joseph mentioned, while there are fights being had at the federal level, there's still so much that the state can be doing to make workforce development and job training services available to everyone, regardless of status. And that means the whole gamut of services. Also, one thing I really want to lift up is including organizations that have been doing the work in workforce development. And what I mean by that are worker centers, day labor centers, community-based organizations have been doing workforce development for years. They've been providing mentorship, career support, English language classes, job training classes, know your rights training. And they have not, up until this point, really been funded, supported, or centered in the workforce development system and conversation. And so I think, one very easy thing that workforce development boards can start doing and workforce development organizations can start doing is reaching out to the worker centers and day labor centers in their communities and thinking about how to fund them, support them, partner with them. And really, as I mentioned before, thinking about workers' rights as workforce development. Know your rights training has to be part of job training and career services. And a lot of the workforce development services can even be provided at the community organizations themselves, because like I said, those organizations have been doing the work anyway for a long time. Other things that have been lifted up in our research and talking with workers and worker organizations themselves are community representation on state and local workforce boards and on every council, committee, board that makes decisions about workforce development, making sure that workforce development plans are community centered. We found in our day labor survey that people want workforce training and adult education that's accessible, culturally competent, and holistic. And so it's just about making sure that they are part of those conversations. Next is also concrete equity and job quality standards. We can't even tell if we're making any progress on equity and job quality if we're not measuring it. And we don't have any statewide metrics to hold ourselves and others accountable. And I've looked at the WIOA metrics, and those do not take equity into account. So we need better benchmarks to evaluate our workforce development and adult education systems. And employers should not be getting our money, our public dollars, if they're not hiring equitably and have equitable workplace standards and practices. And then the last thing is that I just want to emphasize this again, is that workforce development professionals and practitioners need to join the effort to strengthen the social safety net and worker benefits. So that means changing the frames we use when we talk about workforce development, which Insight Center has done a lot of really great work on, to be more focused on systems and structures rather than locating the problem with individuals or talking about the need to train or upskill our way out of the problem. And we need to make sure that workforce development and workers' rights are inextricably linked.
If I can just say, Sasha, that was awesome. And it really builds on a lot of what we accomplished through AB 628. And so want to encourage people to review that piece of legislation because it definitely needs to be preserved and expanded moving forward. CBOs are really the entities that are providing wraparound services and supports. And, that is essential to the success of the workforce system and to workers. And we also really were intentional about the inclusion of know your rights training being something that could be covered in terms of the uses of the funds. And so I really appreciate hearing you articulate some of those opportunities. Earlier I mentioned, how we don't have enough of a focus on really maximizing the kind of current educational achievement of the immigrant population in particular. And I think that there are states that have a more focused and kind of targeted approach on helping to ensure that both employers are able to evaluate foreign credentials and better understand how to interpret and understand what kind of capacity someone may bring to a job. And they have programs at the state level that are more intentional about, really kind of allowing people to either attest to the qualifications that they have or convert their educational achievements into a US credential or a US kind of certification, if you will. And so, the state, I think, can do more in that regard to be able to support people who are coming into this country to be able to find jobs that line up with their capacity. I also think the point that Joseph raised earlier about case management is really critical, because what we've seen is that the people who do well in the workforce system are the people who have help, and the people who have like support and networks of, you know, trusted individuals who are doing everything that they can to ensure that all their needs are met so that they can thrive in a workplace. And, you know, that thinking, I think, is important to apply more broadly throughout, you know, the different kind of classifications of, you know, immigration status, you know, whether you're a refugee or asylum seeker, or what have you, you know, you need to be able to have that kind of wraparound support and service delivery. The other thing that I think is really interesting is tapping into the entrepreneurial spirit that people have. And there are some, you know, kind of small burgeoning programs that the state has embarked upon. Last year, Governor Newsom, with the help of the California Labor Fed and the UCLA Labor Center, advanced the SEED Act, which many of us supported. And it really is, you know, meant to advance, you know, worker ownership and cooperative ownership within economic rights frame to help limited English speaking populations really delve into owning their own business and knowing their own rights within the context of worker ownership. And I think there's an opportunity for more of that. The state can be more intentional about expanding some of these opportunities to, you know, encourage people to strike out as entrepreneurs or expand worker-owned businesses. And, you know, we're in an economy that I think is forcing us to confront all kinds of, you know, somewhat hard truths about just the nature of prosperity and inclusion. And, you know, what would it look like for the state to invest in rapid conversion of businesses that people may want to step away from, but, you know, it potentially give to their employees versus sell on the market. And so, like, how can we allow for that type of, you know, creative thinking to be applied? You know, you hear these stories about how, you know, during the pandemic, more people are leaving their jobs than ever before. You know, people are becoming more mobile, but at the same time, the different kind of structures that we have in terms of you know, opportunities are still kind of very limited. And I think if there was an intentionality around creating some sort of like rapid conversion process where people were able to get into jobs and then potentially slide into ownership of those entities where they're working, that could be a really interesting opportunity, not only for immigrants, but for many people of color and many people who are just seeking a more inclusive economy throughout the state. So I'll stop there, but there are lots of things that I think could be done in terms of being more creative and more intentional about economic justice, in particular for immigrant communities.
Thank you, Mark and Sasha, for those great insights. Folks don't have any other comments on this particular question. Oh, I see Joseph. No, okay. Let's move on to the next question. Please share some training and hiring strategies that lead to good jobs for documented, undocumented, and refugee communities and English language learners.
So I'll start a little bit about some of the things that we notice are important to know. So I think the first one, again, goes back to ensuring that if you have some sort of protection that or legal protection and you're able to work, that employers understand that there's different types of work authorization, that is not just one type of. And I think it's important to note because at one point there were several big employers who, you know, because of their political ideology, decided that if someone had DACA per se, that they will not accept that as a work authorization. document, even though it is part. And so there's actually been litigation that MALDEF is carrying as relates to that. And so I think the first thing as relates to the training and hiring strategies is, entities, those who are hiring workers need to understand that immigration is very fluid and that an employee, can have an immigration status that could change, meaning that that person can have a work authorization and then move to legal permanent resident status. And so there's some protections that and some HR issues that folks have to be mindful of that. Otherwise, they will be potentially violating immigration law. The other thing that is also, at least for us, is not something that we're trying to train employers about, is that the utilization of E-Verify. This is a program that the federal government promotes to employers about a way to verify the immigration status of individuals. That program is flawed. It's actually flagged. It has actually flagged citizens or legal permanent residents as not being able to work legally in the country because that person changed their last name because they got married, or there's a misspell in their last name or first name. And so I think for the first thing about training is that employers need to understand what is current law and make sure that they don't discriminate based on a perception that person could be undocumented and obviously it's tied to a Latino descent. So I think that's the first thing that I will start. I think as it relates to what is some of the good jobs, I think, touching a little bit of what Mark mentioned, I think we have to give credit where credit is due to the governor as it relates to the implementation of potential new programming that actually sees opportunities for immigrants in very different ways and understands that they're entrepreneurs, but not only understand that they're entrepreneurs, but that might be the only source that they might have to work and make ends meet. So I think that's something that for us we're trying to explore. So I think like the seed money that Mark mentioned is this, for us, how do we continue to, that type of funding? How are their matrix to show success? Otherwise, it could be just one-time allocation for resources. So I think for us, we're really looking towards a matrix of success and how the governor is actually putting some work around that, but then also with advocates, how do we also make sure that we fight for to expand some of those opportunities? The other thing, and obviously understanding where our brothers and sisters of organized labor is that at times an immigrant may have no other choice but to be independent contractors. So how you have a balance about being an independent contractor without undermining organized labor. So I think at times that's important for us to understand that if you're undocumented, that might be the only sort of income that you may have. And there are some state laws that were passed that a profession may require a license at the state level, and now they're open to folks regardless of immigration status. So you can be a barber and go through the job training and be an independent contractor and be able to get the license at the state level and also the business license to open your own shop. But I think there has to be a system in which we promote that and then that we foster that. The last thing that I will say as it relates to how do we it's not about hiring strategy, but then also how do we promote and help workers who are in your workforce. So I think that at one point we created a partnership here in Los Angeles with the LA Chamber in which we were actually promoting citizenship among the workforce. And also, for some of those employers to pay for the fees because the fees and legal fees, combined are significant barriers for folks to become citizen. And so I think there's also a way to have partnerships with employers to promote citizenship. And then once someone becomes a citizen, obviously that allows that individual to have different access to different job trainings or jobs themselves. And again, also giving a credit to the governor in their budget, they allocated resources to pay for the fees for DACA individuals, but then also trying to look towards citizenship, because we know that when someone becomes a citizen, it helps the economy of that community, but also helps the economy of the individual.
That last piece, I think is just so important to reflect on, the one around citizenship. And I think that, we have to be more intentional about expanding, organizing on the job and really building worker voice and power, in particular for immigrant communities. You know, we have to be more intentional about encouraging their leadership, encouraging their connection and connectivity to not only services that are not at the job, but, you know, through the job, you know, kind of exposing them to these opportunities, because I think that is a piece about this that doesn't often get enough attention, but is so critical. The way in which they're marginalized within society, that doesn't just end when you get a job, you know, and so being able to conduct some sort of organizing and, you know, engaging them in this, you know, project of this democratic project of, like, you know, being more involved and being more connected is important. And the only way you get to that is, you know, through organizing and engagement, and using the job as a hook for that, I think could be important.
Thank you, Mark and Joseph, for those great points. Sasha, do you have any other comments on this question on training and hiring strategies?
I think a lot of what I shared earlier ties into this, and a lot of what Mark and Joseph shared is really, really important. I do want to lift up again just the importance of thinking about organizing and workers' rights as part of workforce development, and really encouraging immigrant leadership in the workforce development, you know, kind of system, as it were. And really making sure that this, you know, the strategies are guided and led by immigrant workers. The one thing I do want to add as well is there isn't really good data on training and hiring strategies that work, right? And so, you know, again, I don't want to get too wonky with folks, but I think the importance of having equity measures to hold ourselves accountable and really focusing on tracking that data. It's a really hard thing to measure, right? And find causal relationships. But I think that it's important to like take a critical look at the way we're actually measuring progress.
I think just to add, you know, another point, and again, this is something that that was done in the governor's budget and a bill specifically to immigrant youth, understanding that many high school students who may be going to a four-year college right now and are undocumented don't have the protection of DACA because of the current litigation. And so what we're trying to move through a bill with Senator Limon, it's AB 540, which essentially created a new grant, which is a volunteer grant, some sort of a work study for undocumented students, and then make sure that they have the right skills as they're trying to get their education and going to a fellowship program or work study with a nonprofit or an entity that is authorized to the Student Aid Commission to also, get some of the resources. So I think for us, it's more about how do we expand also programming for undocumented youth that at this point may not be able to work because they have no status and there's no protection under federal law. And I think that's something that we're interested in looking at. What else other programs could potentially be aimed at immigrant youth, from the age of 16, who many of them, if they were to be citizens or have legal status, will be able to have access to summer jobs, for instance. At this point, they may not have access because many of those jobs are restricted. And there are other cities or counties that actually have created pilot programs or fellowships. And so we're looking into some of those components, because when we think about job training and good jobs, everything starts about the networking and the experience that an individual has. And so from a young age, we need to start thinking about how do we provide some of those tools to those unlikely, workers, especially those who may not have legal status, to a minimum, when they create the resume, they have, I had an internship here, I had a fellowship here, and recognize that many of them may be forced to go into the underground economy because they might have parents who may also not have legal status and they have to contribute to the household income. And so by having some sort of a programming that allows them to get that professional experience and get paid would allow them to also build a resume and potentially, get a good job once, there's a change in their legal status.
Great point, Joseph. Thank you so much. And just to really uplift, California has a long way of really collecting useful data that can measure outcomes. So we're hopeful that now that the budget approved the cradle to career data system, we'll be able to really see what the workforce training data piece will tell us, apprenticeship data, and also wanted to mention funding, money, money, money. It talks right here in California and at the federal level. We saw in the state budget that we did, although very grateful that the federal government did trickle in dollars towards workforce development. A lot of it was one-time dollars. A lot of it was not really flexible or not accessible to undocumented communities. So that's something that we're hoping that we can get more supportive at the federal level as well. And I think that concludes our questions for our panelists. We do have couple from the public that maybe we can take right now since we have a little wiggle room here. The first one is really more geared towards higher education, and it's from Anonymous, so no worries. So the first question is, can you please comment on AB 705 and what are the benefits, positive impacts, and bottlenecks you have seen so far? In particular, what needs to be done to maximize the probability that student enrolled in English as a second language instruction will enter and complete degree and transfer requirements in English within 3 years? Again, no pressure to the panelists. This really deals with remedial education, but any thoughts or comments here?
I think, obviously, maybe for folks that may not be familiar, this is a law that I think was signed in 2017, if I recall correctly. And so, for us, it's more from the immigrant perspective, understanding that English as a second language does not mean that you're an immigrant. It could be, different things at times. So I think from an immigrant perspective, we always felt that as community college were critical because that's where you have the most undocumented students going there, and then or AB 540 student there, and then transfer to a 4-year college per se. So one of the things that we were really looking into, fixing is making sure that folks knew about the law, but then also knew about any type of resources that were available to them. And so that's why we will carry a bill with, and funding also allocated to that bill, that created a dream liaison staff in every community college, because we feel that immigrants are in a unique place in which at times they don't know some of these laws and they just are trapped, for lack of a better word, into the system. And because of their immigration system, they may, and not knowing how to navigate it, they may need someone that understands their immigration system and feels safe to talk about it. That's what we felt, that having a dream liaison not only was going to help them navigate the current system, but then also alert them about, laws like this one, because at one point, they get lost in the system. So I think for us, the way that we look into that is that it is a great law, but at times implementation and how it's communicated to the student, it becomes critical. And I think for us, even though the dream liaison and funding is not going to solve everything, our hope is that that person will help a student not only when it comes to finding resources available to them, but then also alert them about these types of laws that they have to be mindful, and resources that can help mitigate some of the challenges that they have.
I'd love to respond a little to this one. 705 is tricky, and it is a priority for EDGE. 705, and just to clarify a little bit further what it is, it's pretty much the law that says that when somebody enrolls in college, you can't put them in remedial classes that don't earn college credit. They have to be put in college level classes and be provided with supports to succeed. That's in a nutshell. 705, we're just coming out of the 2-year implementation period. And I'm not going to use the perfect language, and I apologize for that. But, the law was signed and colleges had 2 years to develop a plan or to implement. I forget which of the two. And we're just coming out of that, and there's not a lot of outcome data to point to, and it hasn't been widely implemented. So from my perspective, it's a little hard. And so we've been actually talking to the chancellor's office and others. EDGE is going to be developing an advocacy plan, and we're coming at it from the approach of, I think colleges need some help. We're asking a lot of questions. Well, why isn't it implemented? We have also been leaning into the question of, well, do students know about the law and what that means for them? And what can we do to assist colleges to implement widely? And there's this recognition that the math side of the house versus the English language side of the house is very, very different. And their implementation challenges are very different. So I really do appreciate that question. I hope Anonymous, in my closing remarks, I'll share how to stay in touch. Would love to keep talking about that. Again, this is a priority for EDGE, and we are in the process of developing a plan to dive deeper. Also, we have agreed that we'll be working on a list of questions that we hope will be included and answered in the some of the early outcome reporting data that probably 5 years after the law is signed is probably when we'll start seeing that. So maybe 3 years out. And this is just guesses, but we want to kind of get in front of that and say, once we're there, we would love for these kind of questions to be answered in these outcome reports. And so this is, a great candidate for that list that we're putting together.
Thank you, Zima and Joseph, for that insight on 705. Lots of work to do there for sure. And shout out to Wesley Whittaker from Assemblymember Irwin's office in the comments on championing this issue as well. We do have a comment from Jaime Pacheco Orozco around WIOA. And panelists, feel free to jump in if you'd like to provide some comments on this one. It would be interesting to see how many more ELL individuals would be served through the WIOA system if ELL status was a required field rather than one of several eligibility criteria. This is particularly noticeable if you look at how many youth in the state's workforce development system are identified as ELL as compared to those in the educational system.
And noticeable meaning that there's more in the education system than in the workforce system. Are we to assume that that's what Jaime was getting at?
I believe so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think that there's a need to be more specific about the different populations that are in great need in terms of our workforce system, which is why within the context of AB 628, we try to enumerate so many specific target populations and communities that have trouble participating in the labor force. When you think about the way that the education system is worked in our equity formula here in California, it is targeting English language learners, young people in poverty, and people who are experiencing, who are in the foster care or child welfare system. And I think that has been helpful in terms of trying to address some of the peculiar challenges that they face and the really deep-seated issues that are at play within the system. And the workforce system could benefit from taking a similar approach. What would it look like to have an equity formula in terms of how the services and the programming was rolled out? Right now that doesn't exist, but I do think that there is some promising lessons there.
I want to push back a little bit because I think what Mark's saying is important, that if you don't require certain communities to be prioritized, they're not going to be. So in that sense, I think it's important. However, I don't think putting that sort of requirement guarantees better outcomes for immigrant communities, because right now, we don't actually have a good way of even looking at to what extent our workforce development programs and services are working or not. I can tell you the WIOA metrics right now. It's looking at how many people were served, which can mean a range of things. It tells you how many people exited, which does not necessarily mean successful completion. And it tells you how many people were employed, a certain number of quarters after exit, which again, doesn't even necessarily mean successful completion. So even if we required that certain communities are prioritized for these services, we don't actually have any guarantees that those services are going to be what people actually need and want and are good at serving them.
And Sasha, just to build on that, I don't disagree with that point at all. The education system, which was lifted up as an example, has serious accountability issues in terms of being able to understand some of the same issues and really how these resources are being applied in ways that impact those students. So there's an ongoing debate there. I don't want to unpack it, but the same issues that you're outlining are roughly at play in the education system.
Definitely.
Thank you for that. We have 2 more questions here. The next one is, are there opportunities to advocate for work-life balance, work-life harmony for undocumented workers? I think most have limited time to upskill or take English classes. Also, is there any push to make English learning courses fully virtual?
I think this conversation on work-life balance is actually really important because I think it ties back to the need to really, again, center workers in these conversations and to not locate the problem with individuals about their need to upskill or get a certain certificate or credential or whatever it is, that the problems are actually systemic. And I think the workforce development system kind of needs a whole redesign that takes a human-centered approach and works to actually break down the structural and systemic barriers rather than counting the number of people who've participated in a program. So I think in that sense, it's a really important conversation to be having and to really kind of reimagine what does it look like to help people get their needs met and to help them achieve their dreams and aspirations. And with regards to having English language classes virtual, I would say that's got to, people have different needs and schedules, and it's got to depend on what their needs are. Not everyone is going to be comfortable with that. Some people are going to be more comfortable, being with their local community members. Some are going to be more comfortable and deserve to have that type of instruction at work, so there's and I would be remiss if I didn't also say, I think we need to stop having English language be the end all be all. There are many jobs for which English language is not a requirement, and we don't offer any job training programs in languages other than English. And I think we should start doing that.
Yes, and I just want to build on Sasha's great comments here and say a couple of things. One is, at the top, she mentioned how many of the challenges that our immigrant communities are facing are really challenges that people of color who are born here are also facing. That is absolutely true, especially as it relates to this last point regarding English language and training around language. We know for sure that as a state, we have huge populations of people who speak other languages, yet our systems don't support people to be trained in those languages so that they can communicate with those folks. And so I think there needs to be some rethinking there around the work-life balance piece. I mean, I think this is about building the economy we deserve. What is the kind of economy we want? And then what is the role of labor in it? And like, how do we operate within that? But we don't have a paradigm that really works for us right now. And because of that, we're trying to do end arounds in ways that, are just, unconscionable when you step back and think about it. People are working 60 hours, and then you're expecting them to do classes and, better themselves in a way that is going to allow for them to have some modicum amount of social mobility, and it's not even promised, within the generation. It's a hope, and so I think that is just a harsh existence that we need to rethink. And it's more about what type of, do we want to institute a 30-hour work week? And I know that's a conversation that extends beyond California, but it's those kinds of questions and issues that we should be asking ourselves. How do we, create space for us to live the kind of lives we want, and to allow for us to not be in a position where these false choices have to be made in such, grinding and harsh ways.
I think just maybe adding, I agree with some of the points that, language barrier is one thing, and I think as it relates to digital classes, I think what the pandemic showed us that there's a digital divide among, people of color and immigrant communities. So I think that would be a challenge per se, to have that be institutionalized, or trying to advocate for that one model that fits all, understanding different challenges from different communities. But I think I just want to go back to what, we started about, workforce development is tied to workforce protections or worker rights. I think during the pandemic, what we knew is that some of the essential workers were immigrants, and some of them were, doing their job regardless of immigration status, regardless whether we're proficient on English. So I think there's a question about what is that we're doing to, to really highlight those quote unquote essential workforce, and then what is that we're doing to enhance or strengthen their protections, or make those jobs or those areas of work more safe for those communities. Because if you're a farm worker, you continue to have issues regarding the air that you breathe and the conditions that you work in. If you're a domestic worker, you continue to be exempt, for some labor protections per se, even though there will be a study to deal with that particular issue. And there's still some basic labor protections that we need to, to explore and really strengthen it, especially after, the state elected officials and others have, have been gracious towards them and highlighted as essential workers. Now we need to really strengthen their protections.
Lily, thank you so much, Joseph. And last question, I know we have 3 minutes left, and we'll get to a data question by Wesley Whittaker. How can the state strike the right balance of collecting relevant info about disadvantaged communities from employers? Previously signed legislation like Ban the Box has been cited as a barrier to collecting this info, so we can actually track whether these communities are being reached. And what role should the cradle to career data system play? Anyone want to take a stab at the data piece? I know we mentioned earlier that there will be some workforce training, apprenticeship, career tech education data in there, but what EDGE has been doing, and also has the Skills for California network, is really advocating that there is inclusivity, that we are actually tracking, from what we call from cradle to career, making sure the education to employment pipeline is really considered when folks are trying to get family sustaining wages from the programs that they participate in. Go for it, Zima.
Yeah, and a thought that I had, I would love to cover this question in the upcoming webinar we're going to be doing in November, specific on data. We're going to be partnering with Bright Hive and others who did some local pilot projects. And yeah, one of the many things that are going to come out of that webinar is the importance of the collection of quality data at the local level to inform the data that's going to be collected at the state level. And how do we do that in the pilot projects, without me giving away too much? Some points of growth were identified to collect that quality data. And I think that's a great question, Wesley. I'm sorry we can't dive deeper into it because we're out of time, but I would love to save that question. And I will definitely put that on the list for the data webinar coming up. So with that, we have 1 minute, and we did commit to get you out within 1 hour, 1 power hour. Just want to say thank you, Sasha, Mark, Joseph, Anna. That was amazing. A lot of great info in a very short amount of time. Sorry we couldn't get to all questions, but we will follow up in an email after this event with what we can answer. We also will follow up with an email sharing how to stay in touch with the panelist EDGE Skills for California NSC. We got to keep the conversation going. We're at the end of a 2-year session. We have work to do moving forward. Would love to keep in touch with all of you. So again, thank you to our panelists and moderator, and to all of you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye now.